A generation ago, the title of my talk, Why Western Civilization is Our Future, would have seemed so obvious as to make no sense. But now, as we've heard in many circles, it would be regarded as provocative. This is a sign of the strange and uncertain position our world finds itself in. There's a widespread sense of crises, and certainly a feeling that a future that once seemed certain and optimistic has, like a mirage on the horizon, receded or even disappeared. Many will remember when, in 1992, the American political scientist Francis Fukuyama became an overnight global celebrity with his book The End of History, because he stated that with the end of the Soviet Union, the ideological challenge to Western liberalism had disappeared, leaving it the only blueprint for the future. How different the world now seems, with liberal democracy itself challenged and undermined both from within and from without. I'm not going to try to paint a detailed picture of the world today, which we are well aware of, but let me point out a few underlying trends. For a generation, turnout at elections and membership of political parties has been falling right across the democratic world, while electoral volatility has been rising, as has the growth of anti-establishment movements. Most recently, we see this in Italy, which is undeniably one of the cradles of Western civilization. Russia, far from joining the West since the fall of communism, has mutated into another version of anti-Western nationalism laced with organized crime. And the vicious nature of this system was shown vividly a couple of weeks ago with the nerve gas attack in England. China has consolidated its strange hybrid of communism, capitalism, and nationalism. America is gripped by political and social turmoil and is no longer an effective leader or perhaps even an effective protector of the West. The EU, which its supporters hoped had created a new form of shared sovereignty, faces an uncertain future marked by perhaps terminal economic and social instability. Britain, potentially Europe's main international player, is transfixed by Brexit, with a powerful minority trying to overturn or nullify a democratic decision. Need I go on? Let me quote from a famous poem by Yeats, written just after the First World War, but which often seems to me prophetic of how we might feel today. "Things fall apart," he wrote. "The centre cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity." Well, this might seem a time in which we'd all feel the spontaneous need to rally round the values of Western civilization. But as I said a moment ago, and as we've been reminded already, the very name causes many people who regard themselves as progressive to rebel, though once the idea of progress was a defining characteristic of Western thought. And then the whole idea became tarred in the minds of many people with the brush of imperialism, racism, essentialism, exceptionalism, and other unforgivable intellectual sins of our time. The BBC, always a reflector of orthodoxy, and which in 1969 produced a great TV series called Civilization, has now begun another called Civilizations, in the plural, with a relativist theme. In the history faculty of my university, there was for many years a course entitled The West and the Third World. It's now called Global History. And many of my colleagues would be scandalized if they knew I was giving a lecture here defending Western civilization. My wife says they will know. However, they'd be wrong to be scandalized. I'm not here to suggest that Western civilization is spotless. Who could possibly think this? The West has destroyed cultures, ravaged continents, burnt heretics, invented the gas chamber and the atom bomb, and almost destroyed itself in 2 world wars. Nor am I going to suggest that it's the origin of every form of progress. I fully agree with my late lamented friend and colleague the great anthropologist Sir Jack Goody, who argued that apologists of Western civilization sometimes stole, as he put it, from other civilizations by passing them off as Western innovations. Capitalism, democracy, and individualism all have non-Western origins, he said. Other great civilizations can rightly claim cultural achievements as great as ours. Anyone who's seen the Taj Mahal can hardly doubt it. And some have managed to survive for much longer than we have so far managed. Yes, the Chinese were way ahead of us in political organization and technology. Yes, some medieval Muslim states practiced a degree of toleration and free thought when Europe was sunk in persecution and obscurantism. Yes, some simpler societies seem to have been better than we are in living harmoniously with nature. All this we can recognize and celebrate. So I agree with the global historians. We Westerners can admire and learn from others. And we certainly have things we regret and try to put right. Nevertheless, I'm very happy to argue with complete conviction that Western civilization is our future. The first and most obvious reason is that it's the only one we've got. It's the sum total of our laws, our values, our institutions, of the habits of mind and heart that enable us to live fairly harmoniously together, to trust each other to some extent, to look out for each other, sometimes grudgingly, to understand each other, sometimes imperfectly, and even tell jokes about each other. As you well know, there are some very good ones by Australians about Brits. And being able to do all these things are great and rare achievements. If I were Chinese or Indian or Japanese, I think I'd argue the same, that the best aspects of my civilization need to be cherished and maintained. A society can't just pull up its civilizational roots and choose some other value system. Nor can it invent from scratch a whole new set of values and habits. It's been tried with disastrous results. Remember the attempt to create Soviet man. But you can weaken your civilization by neglecting it and despising it, and we've arguably gone too far along that road already. Then you risk being left not with some better system of values, but with no shared values at all, no sense of common purpose, no basis for solidarity, no understanding of who and what we are. Instead, you just have impatient assertions of individual entitlement and corresponding claims to victimhood, two sides of the same coin, and two of the most annoying symptoms of our present demoralization, and which have dangerously undermined free speech, free thought, equality before the law, and the right to a fair trial. This is not to say that we should be either uncritical of our inherited values or resistant to change. Indeed, one of the characteristics of Western civilization is that it's always been quarrelsome, diverse, and flexible. Some major civilizations like to trace themselves back to a single source, Confucius or Muhammad or the Buddha. But the West has no single ideology, no single text, no single prophet. Even a label we commonly use, Judeo-Christian, shows this hybridity. Our civilization is indebted to yet another source, ancient Greece, for the foundations of its philosophy. Much of it transmitted, I'm very happy to note, by Arabic scholars. We are indebted to ancient Rome for one of our two great legal systems, to the 17th century scientific revolution and the 18th century Enlightenment for much of our modernity. So Western civilization cannot be, by its very nature, wholly stable, wholly orthodox, or wholly united. I always like to think of something a French historian of the Enlightenment said, rather an odd thought, but I think quite a fruitful one. He said the whole future of Western civilization rested on the quarrel between Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the Earl of Chesterfield, who never knew each other, never met. But Rousseau believed that, and he wrote in a sort of fictionalized novel sort of book called Émile, that human beings were naturally good and perfect, and they needed to be kept innocent by being saved from civilization. So Émile, this fictitious child, was to be brought up in the countryside, only allowed to read one book, Robinson Crusoe, kept well away from towns which would corrupt him, and he would grow up as a perfect human being. The Earl of Chesterfield, who didn't know anything about this, wrote a whole series of letters of advice to his son. His son, he wanted to be a diplomat. And it was all about how you have to learn civilization. You have to learn even to be natural, he said. Go to a dancing master who'll teach you how to move in a natural way. Practice it in front of a mirror. You have to learn civilization because that's the way you can learn to live in society. And for this French historian, whose name was Fumaroli, these are two great divisions within the way we think about civilization. Is it all natural or is it all learnt? And I mention this just because it shows how deep is a division within our civilization, because Rousseau and Chesterfield are both two great civilized figures, two great Enlightenment writers, but they couldn't agree on the most basic facts about what human nature is. So I mention this because my point is that our civilization is not uniform. It's always been one in which there is disagreement and argument and change. And that's what gives it its particular character. If there's a single thing that's enabled it to survive, to improve itself, and to make such a mark on the history of our species, it's surely its diversity and capacity for evolution. Western civilization has often seemed synonymous with progress. I have to admit to John, I hope I won't shock him too much, that I'm not a great believer in progress. That is, progress with a capital P, with the implication that human history is in some way pre-programmed to get better and better, that previous ages were essentially inferior to us, and that modern is therefore simply another word for good. This idea of progress dates from the 17th and 18th centuries, and we can associate it with what is commonly labelled the Enlightenment. Yes, certain things improve, and when we talk about this, people always seem to mention dentistry and anaesthetics. And I'm not saying I'd like to go back to having my teeth pulled without anaesthesia. But improvement comes with costs, as we know. It can be reversed, as the 20th century showed so horribly, and it always comes with unintended consequences. We live longer, but often we die more nastily. Now, as you've probably already guessed, I'm not a sophisticated philosopher, I'm just a simple historian. And I'd suggest that we can consider civilization, Western or other, in two ways. First, you could think of civilization as like the laws of physics. These laws are always out there in some sense, and human beings progressively discover them. Or you could think of civilization like the laws not of physics, but the laws of cricket. We don't discover them, we make them, and we agree to them. If you believe in progress with a capital P, I suggest you regard civilization like the laws of physics. You inevitably advance as you discover more. If we take this view, then we do risk adopting both a fragile view of civilization, what happens when it goes wrong, how do we explain that, and also a rather authoritarian one. You have to accept my view because I've discovered the truth. Much human rights discourse is like this. We've discovered a new human right. It can't be discussed. You can't dissent from it. This is quite a good way of intimidating your opponents, though not a very good way of convincing them. And it's a reason why there's so much grumbling about the imposition of political correctness. It goes back quite a long way, certainly to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whom I mentioned before, and probably his idea of the general will, that no one had the right to contest. Friedrich Engels said that Karl Marx was like the Darwin of politics. He was a scientist who discovered how things worked. So either you accepted this truth or you were an enemy to be silenced, or worse. And I'm afraid that this sort of thinking tends to appeal to intellectuals. But if civilization is like the laws of cricket, which I believe, then the story is much more complicated and interesting. Actually, there is a connection between cricket and civilization of a particular kind. When the French Revolution began, the then British ambassador thought he could calm things down by organising a cricket tour of France. As you know, it didn't quite work out. The revolution happened anyway. Marie Antoinette got to have the ambassador's bat as a souvenir, But the French never took to cricket, and they did take to revolution. Perhaps it would have been better if it had been the other way round. The great Scottish Enlightenment philosopher and historian David Hume said loftily that we owed our advances to, he said, a great measure of accident with a small ingredient of wisdom and foresight. We arrive at civilization largely by trial and error, and by unintended consequences, sometimes indeed by accident. Two of the greatest disasters in English history were the Norman Conquest of 1066, when the country came under the oppressive rule of William the Conqueror, and the Black Death of 1348, the bubonic plague that killed around half the population. Yet some good came out of these disasters. The Normans and their successors abolished slavery, there had been slavery, and created the common law. And in reaction to the monarch's excessive power, the country eventually imposed Magna Carta in 1215, giving some rights to everyone forever. And Parliament changed from being simply the King's Council to being the institution that represented the nation and held government power to account. The Black Death, well, what could possibly be good about that? Well, by increasing the demand for workers, it finished off serfdom. So even the worst things can have some good outcomes. Free society and accountable government took a long time, but they eventually happened. And as the great Irish politician Edmund Burke pointed out, they happened in large part through what he called the wisdom of unlettered men. Take another example. The American Revolution of 1776 was not a little motivated by greed and hypocrisy. Apologies to any Americans in the audience, but that's how it was. And yet, through its promise of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, it inspired the world. And take the example of your own history. A dumping ground for criminals became a pioneer of freedom, equality, and democracy. An extraordinary, indeed a unique achievement in history. Now, immediately, there are people who would jump up and object. Magna Carta, they would say, was just about the rights of the nobility. The American Revolution maintained slavery and wiped out most of the native peoples. Australia, they would say, dispossessed most of its own indigenous peoples. And the Reformation burnt witches. The Enlightenment helped pave the way to totalitarianism. The Romans were merciless imperialists. The ancient Greeks kept slaves. Yes, all true, or all partly true, and all well known. But we're not, when we talk about cherishing the values of Western civilization, thinking of slavery, genocide, and persecution. On the contrary, the history of Western civilization is also about how we eventually learn not to do these things, to be ashamed of them, to condemn them, to put a stop to them. Britain traded in slaves. Indeed, it was the biggest trader in slaves in the 18th century. But it also did more than any other country to stop slavery. Women campaigners refused to use slave-grown sugar and sewed together a petition of signatures more than a mile long. The Foreign Secretary wrote to the Duke of Wellington in 1815, "You must really press the Spanish. There's hardly a village that has not met and petitioned." Not because the British had discovered human rights overnight, but because a lot of people argued and struggled to change the nation's mind. Slavery had been around for a long time. People accepted it as a fact of life. Someone had to persuade them that it wasn't. So it was like inventing the laws of cricket, not discovering the laws of physics. But even with the laws of physics, if we believe Isaac Newton's own account, he had his first insight about gravity when he saw an apple fall. So perhaps in practice there's not so much difference between discovery and invention. Both require human thought and action. So where are we? Hume's great measure of accident, Burke's wisdom of unlettered men, Newton and the apple. The Western civilization we have inherited is the result of a long and uneven process that could easily have gone astray. If King John had defeated the barons in 1215, no Magna Carta, no fundamental rights. If James II had intimidated his politicians and people in 1688, no glorious revolution, no religious toleration or freedom of the press. If the Union had lost the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863, slavery and racial exploitation would have continued at least for a generation or two. If Winston Churchill had bowed to pressure and made peace with Hitler in 1940, how different would the world be today? Nazi Germany would have dominated Europe with full access to oil, raw materials, and labor. Eastern Europe and the USSR would have been conquered, and millions of people starved to death. That was the plan. American isolation would have been consolidated. Australia would have had to concentrate all its efforts on self-defense rather than taking part in the global struggle against barbarism. What price Western civilization then? So my point's a simple one. Western civilization is not the triumphant, inevitable story of the quasi-scientific discovery of universal human values. Rather, it's the painful, slow, dangerous, sometimes accidental, and always faltering invention of a set of rules for life. There are rules for our societies, the best we have managed to come up with over many centuries, and certainly they're in need of constant maintenance and improvement. But they're also worth celebrating, defending, and proclaiming. But you might say, are they not also, or some of them, universal values, human rights, not just rights for Westerners? This is an old and difficult question. Edmund Burke, to go back to him, thought it was safer to base rights on inheritance rather than on some abstract theory, to say these are our rights and we owe them to no person and no theory. That's good, but for today, not enough. We nowadays hanker after universal human rights, not just the rights of freeborn Englishmen or freeborn Australians. But it does seem, and I say it in all modesty, that many of the rights that are proclaimed today as universal do in fact stem from the Western tradition, and often the Anglophone tradition, which in modern times formulated, institutionalized, and proclaimed them. They may have had other origins, but as we enjoy them today, they've been made, usually in modern times, as part of our civilization. So what's to stop some dictator claiming legitimacy from another civilization, saying, you Westerners talk about democracy, equal rights, tolerance, but those are Western values, and we have our own different values just as good as yours. Here, Western progressives face a dilemma. They like the idea of universal rights, but they don't like the idea of cultural imperialism, foisting our ideas on others. And there are links between modern universal human rights and Western power. It was colonial authorities and foreign missionaries who tried to stop slavery, the burning of Hindu widows, foot binding in China, cannibalism, ritual killing, child marriage, headhunting, and so on. The dreadful Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya in the 1950s was partly stirred up by colonial attempts to stop female genital mutilation. This is a problem for progressives, though they may prefer to evade it. It's not such a problem for me with my analogy with the laws of cricket. The fact is that many universal values have become universal because of the power and influence of Western states. They are universal because they've been generally accepted as such. It may be that some of these values are truly universal in a deeper sense, in some sense that they belong to a kind of natural law, that they stem from some profound human psychological need that we all feel intuitively. But then, as you know, I'm a historian, not a philosopher, and the distinction, though interesting, is perhaps not as crucial as it may seem. As I've argued, Western civilization has been built up over the centuries by a long and complex process of trial and error, of idealism and of cruelty, of good intentions that turn bad and bad intentions that sometimes turned out good. So it wouldn't be surprising if we have managed to discover and propagate some truly universal values, just as Newton intuited gravity from seeing an apple fall. But in that case, what is Western civilization? If it's always changing, how can it be defined? If it owes so much to accident, why should it be celebrated? And how can such a system be applicable to others? Well, as I've said, we're not celebrating or defending all aspects of our civilization. All aspects of our history were not good. We have to choose what it is to be proud of and what it is that we value. And this changes, sometimes quite quickly. For example, most Victorians would unhesitatingly have said that ours was a Christian civilization. Now we might say Judeo-Christian, but many others would say rational or secular. Some of the things we now proclaim as human rights, say gender equality, would only a few generations ago have been dismissed as absurd. Some others, such as gay marriage, would only a few years ago have been considered lunatic or criminal. Things change. Our ideas of rights change. Is there nevertheless a set of core values or ideas or practices or institutions that provide us with a solid bedrock? Most of us would, I think, perhaps optimistically say yes, and I think we'd probably even agree broadly on what they are. We'd say tolerance, which is largely an invention of the 18th century. People before that didn't think tolerance was good at all. Rationality and the scientific method, again largely from the 17th and 18th centuries, but with a link back to ancient Greece. We'd probably say the rule of law, which has a longer history to the ancient world, but also to the Middle Ages and to documents such as Magna Carta, still part of Britain's constitution. We would surely say to democracy, though that's really only a 19th or even a 20th century development, though again with distant links to the ancient Greeks. We would also, I think, say equality, or at least some notion of equality before the law, and equality of opportunity as an ideal. That too doesn't go back much further than the 17th or 18th centuries. All men are created equal, says the American Declaration of Independence. We'd probably also say things like rights, justice, fairness, which we could certainly trace back to the Middle Ages, and I think largely to the English Middle Ages, and deep down among the very foundations of our civilization are principles derived from the Bible: charity, love, peace, justice, forgiveness. Now, of course, we all know this, we often or always fail to put our values fully into practice. But very few of them could we openly reject. And those who have rejected them, whether in practice or in theory, we might think of Nietzsche or Lenin or the Nazis, have only ever had a short, though still too great, influence on history. So these values, derived from a mixture of ideas and traditions, remain as the shared aspirations of our civilization. But civilization is not just values and aspirations. It's not just a list of ideas. It's also institutions. And here the analogy with cricket is clear. Institutions are things that people invent: law courts, parliaments, churches, schools, universities, the libraries, state bureaucracies, charitable organizations, the mass media, clubs, societies, think tanks. The things that structure and symbolize, regulate and enrich our common life. Sometimes they do it well, sometimes they do it badly, but they're the indispensable pillars of civilization as we live it. And these pillars of civilization need to be constantly preserved, maintained and corrected. We should cherish them, but with tough love. Civilization is an action-packed adventure story, it seems to me, not a philosophical treatise. And that is how we should teach it. The obvious danger of not doing so is that generations grow up, I'm afraid have grown up, not understanding that Western civilization is an extraordinary achievement, but not an inevitable or eternal one. It's dangerous to criticize the failings without recognizing the successes, and it's equally dangerous to take the successes for granted. We who have lived as part of Western civilization since 1945 have been among the luckiest people in the whole history of Homo sapiens, rich, peaceful, healthy. Yet much of our politics and public comment is overwhelmingly negative, both about the present and the past, told as exploitation, conflict, imperialism, racism. It's become commonplace for politicians and ordinary people of all political persuasions to say that they want to change things and make a difference, as if nothing we have is worth preserving. that all difference is improvement, and that the good things we have will be there forever. It seems hard for the modern mind to accept that change can be for the worse, and that many of our achievements and institutions are fragile. They've had to be invented and built. They're not a gift of nature. And this brings me back to the beginning of my talk and the observation that all of a sudden we do have a chilly sense of our civilization under threat. There are lots of things we have to do about this, but one thing that we can do is to teach about it. But what should we teach? I've argued that it's a continuing story, not an abstract philosophy. But what has become the stable of history curricula in many Western countries is not a story at all, but a ragbag of miscellaneous, unconnected fragments. There are several motives at work here, both pedagogical and ideological, but the effect is to destroy coherence, meaning, and any connection between the past and our living existence today as national political communities, and more broadly as part of a connecting civilization. Sometimes the aim is explicit, what its exponents would probably call combating ethnic or cultural superiority and inculcating awareness of our predecessors' misdeeds, an aim with conscious or unconscious, though rarely explicit, political intentions. As George Orwell famously put it, he who controls the past controls the future. These intentions, certainly in the minds of those holding them, may be good, but their effects are far more questionable. Promoting feelings of guilt or shame or cynicism are not a good basis for rational analysis or democratic action. And ignorance of history makes democratic national conversation at best impoverished, at worst impossible. It's not for me, of course, to say what sort of history Australian schools and universities should teach, but I will. I would have thought it should include your heritage from the long Western and Anglophone story that existed before Australia began. Then comes the history of Australia itself, a gripping example of the process by which Western civilization became global, and which gives you a special role and a special responsibility in history. David Lowenthal, in his brilliant book, The Past is a Foreign Country, puts the point very powerfully. I quote, "The past is integral to our being. We learn to live courageously with its totality, as aware of and alert to its defects and malfunctions as to its glories and virtues. It's neither intellectually nor morally honest to falsify, distort, or sentimentalize the past as a form of therapy or virtue signaling. That way lies the hypocrisy of pretending to be what we're not. Let's live courageously with what we are." Thank you.